Hello?
Okay, cool.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to Just the Facts, this panel discussion hosted by Amazon Crossing. Together with my colleague Liza Darden, I'm a senior editor at Amazon Crossing, Elizabeth Denoma, me. Amazon Crossing has been publishing award-winning works of fiction and commercial titles since 2010, as well as narrative nonfiction. At the end of the table here, we have Roland Glasser. Roland translates from French and is a founding member of the Starling Bureau, a London-based collective of literary translators established to bring top-quality books to publishers. His translation of Fiston Mwanza Muhia's Tram 83 won the Etisalat Prize for Literature 2016 and was longlisted for the Man Booker International Prize and the Best Translated Book Award. In addition to fiction, he has translated a wide range of coffee table books, art titles, travel guides, and miscellaneous nonfiction. Most recently, the best-selling How to Live Like Your Cat by Stéphane Garnier.
And next to him, we have Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp, who is a British literary translator working from German, Russian, and Arabic into English. She graduated from Oxford University in 2003, did an MA in translation and interpreting at Bath University, and holds a postgraduate diploma in translation in all three of her language combinations. Ruth has translated many novels, too many to list here, as well as nonfiction books on nature, history, politics, civil rights, child psychology, linguistics, art history, literary criticism. She's also translated plays from Russia, Syria, and Lebanon, and several short stories and children's picture books. And then we have Ruth Martin, who is a translator of fiction and nonfiction from German. Her recent translations include Michael Kohlmeier's novels Two Gentlemen on the Beach and Yiza, and Bettina Stangneth's biography Eichmann Before Jerusalem, which was a finalist for the Kundal History Prize. She's co-chair of the Translators Association and helps to run the Emerging Translators Network.
And right next to Liza, we have Michele Hutchison. Michele was born in the UK and has lived in Amsterdam since 2004. She was educated at UEA, Cambridge, and Lyon universities. She translates literary fiction and nonfiction, poetry, graphic novels, and children's books. Recent translations include novels by Ilya Leonard Pfeiffer, Esther Gerritsen, Sander Collard, and Tam Lemoine, plus The American Princess by Aniette van der Zijl, which is being published very shortly by Amazon Crossing. She is also co-author of the successful parenting book, The Happiest Kids in the World. Before we go any further, can everyone hear us? Can you? All right, wonderful. Is it too loud? Okay, thank you.
So welcome to all of you. It is such a wealth of talent and experience. And I would love to just kind of go through, maybe starting with you, Roland, and take 5 minutes or so, each of you, to just discuss your experience in nonfiction, some of the books and projects you've worked on, and any kind of initial insights or thoughts that you have to share that may seem relevant to the conversation to start us off.
Okay, well, I guess I'm here representing the lowbrow. I've not written, translator. I've not translated books about the history of the horse or lesbian nuns or Nazis or things like that, but I've done, countless coffee table books of varying degrees of textual quality, because who buys a coffee table book for the text, right? You buy it for the pretty images. So I've translated material on anything from trucks to knives, as in from the flint knife to the modern tactical knife, tennis, cycling, land art, photography, photographic guides, tour guides, and it's interesting. I mean, from the perspective of a literary translator, it wasn't until I started getting into literary translation that I realized quite how much all of this previous experience had really served me. Because even when you are translating a coffee table book that's full of these awful little, quite short, elliptical bits of text, where the author is waffling on to say the same thing 3 times because they've got to fill up this blank page next to the lovely photograph. It's actually quite hard work, believe it or not. It requires a certain amount of research, a certain amount of fact-checking. I think that's also a disease we all have as translators. It's impossible to work on anything without checking that really is the case. Is the mountain really 3,127 meters high, or is it 3,126? We want to make sure it's right, don't we? Or it could be more mundane things like the other day I had to correct the name of London's former mayor to Ken Livingstone from Kevin Livingstone. Red Kevin doesn't have quite... Sounds more like a football manager. And so the kind of work you have to do on non-fiction, even if it is the most mundane, lowbrow, stupid sometimes material, up to the most erudite, it's actually really good craft and training, good to hone your craft for any other type of translation that you do. That's the main thing I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I thought I'd just talk through the non-fiction books I've done over the years and just show how it sort of helped me get into literary translation more generally. Because I think when I was doing my first degree, which was really focused on literature, I had this dream that I would love to be a literary translator, but I don't think I realised it could be a career, and I was really sort of more focused on literary fiction. And with time, I've come to realise that being a literary translator means translating books, but a really wide range of books, and actually translating non-fiction has been for me as enjoyable as translating fiction, and has also sort of helped me get established in doing children's books and doing novels too. So my first non-fiction book that I co-translated was way back when I was still on my gap year at university, and I worked for a charity in Russia, and that was a sort of cooperative orphanage for children, and co-translated a book about child psychology and their sort of approach to therapy in that community. And I certainly didn't even imagine that would ever be published. I knew nothing about the publication process. So it's sort of out of the blue, a few years later, I got sent a copy of it in the post. I was like, oh, they actually published it. And so that sort of, I suppose, accidental process at that project sort of actually gave me a publication which enabled me to join the Society of Authors, which is something I recommend all aspiring literary translators do. Thank you. Yeah. Here's our representatives of the Translators Association, which is the translators section of the Society of Authors. Yes, once you've got a contract to translate a book of any kind, or even a section of a book, I believe.
Ruth, I'm sorry, I think you have to speak.
Not talking quite directly enough. Even while you're negotiating a contract, you have the right to join the Society of Authors. And yeah, like I say, I recommend you do. And then having that publication then sort of, I suppose, sort of opens the doors to publishers thinking you're a viable translator to take a pitch on. So I did more books, and the first non-fiction book that I suppose really got me some exposure and some brilliant reviews was The Crossing, which was about by Sama Yazbek, a Syrian journalist who's living in exile in Europe, in Paris. And that was a really, really tough book about the Syrian war, about her experiences sneaking back into Syria to talk to rebels and people living in just utterly dire situations. And that was an incredibly difficult experience, but my first really positive experience of collaborating on a translation, and I worked with Nashwa Gowanlock on that, and that really sort of gave me confidence to pursue collaboration as a way of doing books which I definitely couldn't do by myself, just because of time, and the scale of a book project is really massive, and I work part-time around small children and just have to really be careful about what I can take on. And so I found that collaborating on a translation in various different ways is a sort of security to take on something that I couldn't do on my own, and if I sort of need to step back a bit or do more, we can sort of be flexible about how we split the work. but I'm always the very pedantic kind of copy editor on those sort of translations. So then I've done another couple of collaborations. So a wonderful craft book for kids with Jessica, who's in the audience here, and a really heavy, dense academic book about linguistics, Slavic and Turkic linguistics. That was a collaboration. But then the thing that I probably would talk about more today is the books that I've done more recently, like the cultural history of horses, Farewell to the Horse, which is by far the biggest thing I've ever done, and I pretty much had a nervous breakdown at the end of it. But it's been a really good book to have worked on. And now I'm doing the second of a nature book by a quite a well-known German author, forester, called Peter Wohlleben. And that's in itself a challenge because he's already had two quite high-profile books out. So following in the footsteps of his first brilliant translator is a new scary challenge. But something I've really, really enjoyed working on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ruth, please. Other Ruth. Yes, I'm the other Ruth.
With one.
Yeah. So the non-fiction books that I've done have been a couple of memoirs, very different. One by quite a high-profile German who has been in prison for the last couple of years, and another ghostwritten, but supposedly by Waris Deary, who was a supermodel in the 90s and now campaigns on FGM. I've also done books on psychotherapy, child development, hairstyles, the German Revolution, Adolf Eichmann, and, as Roland mentioned, scandalous lesbian nuns. So there's been quite a variety, but I suppose my specialism within that would be, broadly speaking, history, psychology, philosophy. And that happens to be related to what my PhD was on. So, but that's not actually how I got into that sort of translation. It was essentially I just got lucky with the first non-fiction book that I translated, which was the psychotherapy book. And from then I think people passed my name on because they knew that I was reliable for that sort of thing. And I do probably more academic books, a bit of narrative non-fiction, but usually things that have, a lot of end matter, footnotes, endnotes, glossaries, that sort of thing. And I really enjoy it, actually. I think non-fiction is a bit of a Cinderella discipline, and people always assume you would rather be translating novels. But a lot of the time that's not true. I love translating non-fiction. And I think the challenge is, if you're doing narrative non-fiction and memoir and things like that, the challenges are almost indistinguishable from fiction in a way. But then there are interesting challenges with style that are specific to more academic books as well. So yeah, I mean the book on 115-minute hairstyles was not my finest hour as a translator, but there are definitely books that you do for money, and books that you do because they're really interesting. And that's one of the joys. I mean, as in translation as a whole, one of the joys is that you get to skip from one subject to another. But particularly with non-fiction, you become a kind of an expert in a field at a quite shallow level for 6 months or so, and then you get to move on and do something completely different. So I would definitely recommend it. If someone offers you a non-fiction book, take it, absolutely. There are probably subjects that I wouldn't take on. I say I have a specialism, but that's just because one editor has given my name to another editor who's doing something similar, and that's how it worked. But I probably wouldn't take on sort of physics or chemistry or anything very academic about art or music, probably, but just not because I don't think I could, but because the research would take too long. So for me, that's a consideration when I'm looking at what I'm going to accept as well. yes, one other thing that I wanted to say was that Anthea Bell worked for New Grove Musical Dictionaries throughout her career, pretty much. And she said to me when I was first starting out, do something that isn't literature, partly because it exercises the mind, but also because you need to eat, and that's it's good to sort of broaden your scope as well. I'll stop.
Thank you.
Now for stopping.
Hi, is that the right distance? This is the right distance, yeah. I just wanted to say I'm not just a non-fiction translator, I do most genres, and what attracts me to all the translations I do is primarily a sense of voice. So to me it doesn't matter whether it's fiction or non-fiction as such as the way it's told. So if we're just looking at the last two translations I did, which is An American Princess, which is here on the outside of the stands for Amazon Crossing, and Stage 4, which is a novel which is also for Amazon Crossing. There's a certain overlap between them, and there's an overlap between the challenges you find in non-fiction and in fiction, and I just want to give you a couple of examples of what they are. If I just read the first line of this one, the Stage 4. Niels Holgersen, holding onto the neck of Martin the gander, followed the lead goose, Akka, toward Öland. This is a paraphrase of Niels Holgersen, which is a famous Swedish children's book, and this is fiction. In order to rewrite the first page in English, I had to go back to Niels Holgersen and look at it with the editor who speaks Swedish. So in a way, that's the kind of thing you do with non-fiction. You go back to the source and you see what the author has based their knowledge on. And then this one starts, picture this, an old woman and the sea. The woman was old and not even a shadow of the beauty she had once been. And that's a very literary start to a non-fiction book. In fact, it could almost be a novel. You're being asked to picture something in a way. She opens the door on the world of this woman, and then you gradually get to know her. In this one, I was mainly translating what was there and not so much looking at the facts myself, because they were based on letters and documents and some things that were not in the public arena, so I couldn't actually access the sources. They belong to closed archives. And on this one, since it's set in Sweden, which is not my area of knowledge since I translate from Dutch, I spent more time looking up things about Olof Palme, Swedish culture, and the things that I didn't know about. So in a way, there were many similarities between translating fiction and non-fiction.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to just have a sort of guided discussion now, and we're going to save some time at the end for questions. We'll have about 15 minutes, so if you have questions, please keep them in mind for the end. One thing I'm curious about, just to sort of start us off, and you, Michele, alluded to this a little bit already, but how is the experience of translating nonfiction, the experience of it different for you as you're going about doing the work? Is it, if you were to be able to choose one or the other, do you sort of develop a preference? Is it like a red wine, white wine kind of thing? Is it based on just sort of agnostic? It's not nonfiction or fiction, it's the topic. Is it practicality and opportunity? What kinds of things would be going through your mind when you would decide whether or not to take on a nonfiction project? And what is the experience? How is that experience different in doing the work? Does anyone in particular feel compelled?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's usually the money.
Yeah.
I mean, I would almost say that can be true for fiction too. I mean, it may not pay riches, but it pays something. And I mean, translating non-fiction, depending on what kind of work it is, it can take less time than fiction, but not if you have to do a lot of research. So, yeah, I mean, on balance, it probably pays a little better. I think there's probably very few of us that get offered so many non-fiction books that we sit there thinking, well, hairstyles or Eichmann, which shall I do? You know, it doesn't quite necessarily, you know, work like that. I mean, there possibly are certain projects which, in and of themselves, are more attractive. I did a book which was by a French land art artist, and it was called Land Art in Town, or the English title was, and it was sort of urban interventions involving leaves and sticks and things like that. And for various reasons which I can't remember all the details of, possibly because they were editing the book in various ways, I basically ended up pretty much writing the photo captions myself. In fact, the book was little more than photo captions, and I think they might have been written with a lot of French references, possibly, and play on words, and so the English publisher was basically, well, you know, just you do that yourself.
I've done that kind of book when I wanted a copy of the book, when I liked
it was almost like that,
book.
I tell you, and it was like, okay, and these are really cool pictures, and it's you know, and so that made it easier to say yes. Plus, it gave me a good excuse to say, well, since you kind of want me to do a bit more creative work on this and actually write something, could I get a higher fee?
Right, well, which is another question and sort of begs the follow-up question, which is, it can be less work, but I can also imagine that it can be vastly more work to do a nonfiction book because of the one of the, as you were saying to begin, one of the sort of driving needs of a translator is to fully understand and immerse him or herself in every aspect of the text. And when you're doing that with nonfiction, which would require a whole set of fact-checking, and at the process of the translation process, pre-editing, that fact-checking would not have already occurred. I wonder how you handle that, what kind of time it would take, what kind of demands of time it would take, and also if that's something that comes up as you contract the book, to account for that, how much more time it will take you, and also how much you need to do.
I think that this is something that really comes with practice and over a very long period of time, is working out how difficult a book is going to be, how much research is going to be involved, how much checking, and therefore how much time you're going to need to set aside, and therefore how much you should charge for it, because I really do think it's important not just to charge a per word rate or in response to the volume of the text, but to think about and actually calculate and work out how long it could take you, how long they're giving you, how long you've got, how long you can negotiate, and to set aside a reasonable amount of time and to charge accordingly. And of course, as you get more experience, you've got more standing to ask for that. But with your first books, you're not necessarily in such a strong position to sort of command the rate that you want. But yeah, like a couple of people have said so far, I wouldn't say that a non-fiction book is automatically going to be more work or less work than a novel. I've done a crime novel which I could just translate straight off really quickly in little more than a month, and then equally, there's been novels where there's a lot more research. But yeah, I think on the whole for non-fiction, if there may well be a lot of fact-checking, and I personally I am very pedantic and very cautious and nervous. I might make a mistake and I end up doing a lot more fact-checking than perhaps is truly necessary if the copy editor is also going to do that. But that's also something that comes with practice, and with time, getting to know the publishers that you work with. You don't know in advance how active or proactive the copy editor is going to be, how many proofreaders are going to read your work. But I've been lucky that I've had repeat commissions from the same publisher, and now I know and trust very deeply in their input and their support. And that doesn't mean I do less of a thorough job, but it is reassuring, I suppose.
one of the things with nonfiction is the notes and apparatus at the back, and Ruth touched on that. And there are different cultures. So whereas in Dutch books, they don't require you to list the page number of your source, in American books they do. And I found out that both with the book that I co-wrote, which was nonfiction, because we hadn't listed all the page numbers and we had to go back and look them all up for the American edition, and with the American Princess, where again the author had to go back to all the sources and find out the exact dates and a lot more detailed information to satisfy the very strict fact checker that Emerson had.
She's looking at me because I was the editor on that book, and I obviously couldn't go and look up the Dutch references. So, but that lends itself to the next. What I wanted to ask of you next is: would you feel comfortable sharing something unexpected that happened in an instance of your translation of nonfiction? Something unexpected, or some significant lesson that you learned?
Well, I think if you're writing nonfiction or if you're translating, be aware of the differences in source matter. Right. I don't know if anything was particularly unexpected. What I really enjoyed with the process was working with the author and the Dutch editor and you too, Elizabeth, to straighten out all the extra information that we needed. That was almost like being an author myself, and the kind of the way that I could go to the author and she'd take up boxes of archives and I could see old pictures, and that was wonderful.
Yeah, it was like a puzzle, solving a puzzle. What about the rest of you? Anything unexpected?
Well, the book that I'm translating at the moment, which is about the German Revolution, and it's brilliant. I think it's technically non-fiction, but it's written like a novel. But it's probably about 30% quotes, which I suspect is going to be a permissions nightmare, which I'm technically not my problem, but we are having to kind of negotiate. Some of these quotes are from people like Rilke and Thomas Mann, and people whose diaries and letters and things have been translated into English, and you can find them in the library if you look hard enough. But it's, yes, going through and finding all of those quotations in English, and my goodness, it's time consuming.
But can I just ask whether you found the translations adequate? Because I translated a French non-fiction book, and I felt I had to retranslate some of the quotes because the existent French translations were very dated and quite mouldy, some of them.
Also that they don't perhaps actually reflect the point that the author's trying to make. Mm-hmm. If the author is referring to the original text and then the only published translation actually sort of slightly changes the emphasis, then actually that quote won't necessarily do. So I found that.
True. And just a technical detail about that is I think that it changes the permission requirements if you have retranslated it, which just sort of, which also just goes to show that it's good to have a conversation about these kinds of things with your editor before any of it begins. Also to learn from the editor what that publisher's standards for fact-checking is, and maybe even arrange for some of it to happen contiguous with the work you're doing, if that is helpful. But yes, always discuss with your editor. And actually, that brings me to another question, which is, how is the relationship, and is the relationship with the author any different when you're working in nonfiction? Is it more or less important or useful to have a kind of personal back and forth with the author? Is it just the same as fiction? In terms of capturing the voice and capturing the intent, is there any difference there between the two?
I think it depends on the type of book you're translating, because non-fiction covers such a broad field, and the academic books that I've translated, I did 2 for Knopf in the US, and the first one, the author was amazing, and she spoke brilliant English, and she took me out for lunch. It was great. But I think without that relationship, there were things in that book that wouldn't have quite been right, I think. And the other book I did, the author was a very high-powered German academic and wouldn't talk to me at all except via his PA, who wrote to the publisher. I think I felt very frustrated by that, and I felt like I really wanted to talk to him, and there were questions I wanted to ask him that I just couldn't. So.
And did you feel it was reflected in the work you were able to produce, in a sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was really lucky when working on the Farewell to the Horse by Ulrich Ralph that his English was so good, and actually I didn't realise until afterwards, but he was actually an experienced translator himself. So he was very sympathetic to the questions that I asked and the challenges I faced, and he really appreciated the extremely detailed questions I asked, and in some places I spotted, without realising it, I spotted mistakes in the original German because there were things that just didn't quite make sense, or having fact-checked something, the names didn't quite match up, and he was like, oh yeah, that's because it was wrong. So it was really worth having a very detailed chat with him, and I was really grateful that we could.
Sometimes you need the author to clear up things that you can't find out from research because you don't have access to it, perhaps if it's private documents. One of the things in The American Princess was just any time she used the word nicht, which is both niece and cousin in Dutch, and it's quite right to you need to get the relationship right if you're talking about a family tree, but yeah.
Well, I am wondering, is there anything you would like to say to people out there who are thinking of doing a nonfiction book, maybe nervous about it or concerned? Is there any time when you agreed to do it and then sort of felt it was you were in over your head in any sense? Is there any kind of degree of specialization that you think you need to have, or can you just sort of go for it and think of it as just a new adventure in translating?
I wouldn't do what Ruth does, which is academic books. I think you need specialist knowledge for that and a kind of background in the subject matter. So personally, I would only stick to like narrative nonfiction.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, there are definitely subjects that I wouldn't touch, but no, I think you can just get stuck in. I wouldn't say no to anything because you're scared of the subject matter. There is always an option to, the author is good to clear things up with. You have that resource. There are plenty of online glossaries for niche subjects, and you can get in touch with experts in the field, whatever your subject is, in the UK or the US. People are generally nice and are happy to help you out with specialist vocabulary or to explain things to you if there's something you don't really understand about what you're translating.
Yeah, I would agree. I think seeking help from a sort of wide network of other translators or other experts, I think, is very important. And for me, it's really helped me gain confidence to translate in areas or subjects where I wouldn't have been so confident. And that's a wide range of forums, like I'd ask questions in the Translators Association forum or the ETN, the Emerging Translators Network. There's been some just fantastic ideas that have come out from asking the hive mind, even just about, it's often translators ask each other about idioms or some proverbs, puns, plays on words. And of course, nonfiction can be as rich in that sort of stylistic challenge, just as fiction can be. But then, in terms of subject matter, I think I would personally only feel comfortable translating the sort of books that I read anyway, but I've always loved nonfiction, and I do read a very wide range of books, and I suppose I've always sort of flitted between reading a novel, then a history book, then a novel, then travel. So they're areas I'd feel most confident. But I am lucky that I do know a lot of clever, nerdy people with subject expertise. And in fact, I sent a chapter about Kafka to you, didn't I, to check when the book about horses, supposedly about horses, was much more about horses in art, horses in literature, horses in philosophy, horses in, the literature bits I was generally fine about, but I still wanted to check with people who have got more expertise than me. And yeah, mostly people have been really, really happy to help.
Me personally, there are very few subjects which I would take on unless the book was aimed at a general readership. I mean, my specialisms are kind of limited. Yeah. I remember the very first book I did was about the history of the Tour de France. And all I knew about cycling was a bike has two wheels and pedals. Like, I really knew nothing. And, there's a certain tradition of, well, every country has its own tradition of sports writing, and France has its own particular one. And cycling is, of course, very big in France, and there are idioms which are used in the common language. Luckily, I had an English friend who'd always been really into cycling, and so I had to sort of, get up to speed pretty quick, no pun intended. And I say, well, there's this funny expression, in English we say that. I think that probably most of the books that you will have all translated in non-fiction, with the exception of the academic ones, probably have been for a more or less general readership. And so the book itself is teaching you. I did a couple of books for a small French publisher who, for various reasons, the guy who ran it also ran a polar tourism company, cruises to the Arctic and stuff like that. And I did a book about sea ice. There are all different types of sea ice, and the terminology can get quite confusing. And sometimes between the two languages, you'll have a blanket term which maybe in French means several types of ice, but in English it gets more specific, or vice versa. So, the book does explain that, and then, you have Wikipedia, which, and other websites. But actually, that's an example of a book which was actually really interesting, because I didn't know that there were all these different types of ice, and the temperatures at which they formed, and the wind speed that caused them, and stuff like that. Yeah.
Before we open it up for questions, is there anything that we talked about when we were planning the panel that we've neglected to discuss here that we want to take up, or anything else you want to say before we open the floor for questions?
I was going to say something, I forgot it.
Okay. Do we have a mic?
Oh, okay. Do you want something?
Yeah, I do have something to say. I have something to say.
Please do. Rowan, it's one more.
Okay, sorry.
One more.
No, I was just, while thinking about this panel, I was put in mind of a historical novel that I co-translated with Louise, who is over there, called Trajan's Ground, about a 16th century Catholic musician recusant, and it's a fictionalized memoir based on a real person. And much of it is set in England, and there are many references to all sorts of historical facts, and also quite a few original documents which the author had researched and then translated into French. But at the time we were working on the novel, she was quite ill, and so she was staying in her flat in Geneva, but all her archives are in Zurich, and so she was like, if I was in my flat, I could really lay my hands on exactly that document, but I don't know. And so, we would have to go to the British Library and try and find the right document and work out, based on her French translation, what the original quote was. And this was for a novel. But it could have been non-fiction. And the interesting thing about that book was that, it was a novel, but it was a memoir, so it was like translating an autobiography.
My question was actually kind of related to that. I did a nonfiction book a couple of years ago that involved an enormous amount of quote verification, quotes from different languages. I had to find direct English translations. There were no page numbers. I had to go into archives, which were only open at certain times of day. I was working full time, and it actually, by the end of it, added up to an extra 3 months of the project. That and other background research that had to be done on this particular book. And it occurred to me afterwards, because of the way this book was funded, this wouldn't have worked, but it occurred to me afterwards that maybe I should have asked for, this is my fee to translate, and then here is like an hourly rate for the research that I'm going to have to do on top of it. And I'm about to do another book that will probably involve a lot of historical research. I'm realizing that I really don't know how long that will take because I don't know what I'm going to find or not find. And I'm debating whether to start having that try having that conversation with the publisher. I was wondering if that was something any of you had ever tried, or if you had other kind of workarounds for this whole open-ended research problem.
I think basically if you don't ask, you don't get. So it's, they may say no, but it's definitely worth asking. I was very lucky that with the one really big book I did, there were so many questions. When I had submitted the book, there were so many questions still outstanding, which sort of made it look like I hadn't finished my work, but really actually it just was, there was so much work to do. The publisher actually offered to pay me some more to chase them up, so that really surprised me, and of course I gratefully accepted. And then in another case, on the crossing, there were a lot of questions to take to the author, and that involved translating into Arabic. So I think you translated some of the correspondence with the author, because it was just so overwhelming how many questions to ask. And although I happily read Arabic, it's very slow for me to type out Arabic. So yeah, we actually managed to get some extra money from the publisher for that. So it's definitely worth asking.
Hello. There doesn't seem to have been a lot of discussion about writing styles and register. And I was just wondering, do you find if somebody's got a particularly, say, turgid writing style, very dense with facts and stuff, A, does it affect how you work? And B, do you ever get the slightest temptation just to streamline a little bit, maybe use a simpler word where he's used this incredibly erudite word?
Yes. I suppose there's no point being so faithful to the original that you produce something that's unreadable in English, because what is the point of that? You've got to think about the market for the book, the people who are actually going to be reading it, and what they are expecting from it. And certainly if I came across something like that, the first thing I would do is talk to the editor and say, or give them a little sample of what the prose is really like, and say, do you want me to tweak this a bit?
Yeah, totally. I do see being a translator as being another stage of copy editing to an extent. And I often have this discussion with editors about what I am willing to change, what I'm not willing to change, and warn them in advance. I'm going to send you a really long supporting document with my comments about the text, and highlights things that I've fleshed that out with a bit more not necessarily commentary, but just sort of if I need to gloss something, I would often highlight that I've added some words. You can't highlight every single example of when you change the text slightly, but I think it really is helpful for the editor to know that the text has needed some tweaking, and to justify any changes in that respect. But yeah, I think that the consistency the quality of the style of writing is as important as the factual information that you convey. To be accurate to a text, you've got to convey the information, but also the rhetoric and the nuance and the emotional content of the book. And if you sort of too slavishly maintain the complicated syntax of the original, you're going to lose some of that emotional impact on the reader. And so, yeah, you've got to tweak in according with more English style, standards. And also it's very possible that the original text was actually published for a more academic audience, whereas it's going to be published in the UK for a trade publisher. The audience is going to be more general. So it's really worth having as much information as possible from the editor about how they're pitching this book, and then to have an ongoing dialogue about, is it fair, is it justified to tweak it slightly. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Thank you. First of all, this was lovely. Thank you so much for it. My question concerns veracity, fact-checking, and time, specifically when it involves cooperation with experts on the ground. If you're stuck with a specific topic, or especially academic subjects, I've been a translator my whole life. I've only translated nonfiction, and I specialized for a significant amount of time in EU legislation. Now I don't know how far that qualifies as nonfiction. I think it does in an extreme sort of way, in the sense of there's absolutely no space for creativity whatsoever. But I've had many really situations with extremely tough choices, and this is where my question is. The tough choice being veracity or quality, especially if you're facing a completely unmovable deadline. So you cannot. So the situation is you cannot renegotiate the deadline, and there is no way, because you depend on the external knowledge, and there is no way you can. You have to make a choice: either high spec quality of translation, or which in legislation is not necessarily a problem, but either a high quality of translation or veracity. You cannot have the two things. What would you do?
The editor.
Good question.
Yeah. Is there an editor involved?
In EU legislation, well, there's like a whole bunch of it's a process, yes. With there is quality control, and you will also have in the end probably lawyer linguists who will. But my question is wider than that. My question is wider than that. So in whatever process you are, if you will have an editor somewhere on the line, but ultimately your responsibility is the quality and the veracity of your product. What would you do?
What I would say, I suppose, in general, is that the more that a text, any text, certainly non-fiction, is about information and conveying that information, the more you have to pay attention to making that clear and making that understandable.
So
and if you do that, then it is a quality translation, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly times where there might be a metaphor or explanation of something which just won't translate well, and then the quality of writing has got to be more important, I think, than maintaining that metaphor or maintaining that idea that was in the original text, if it's not going to work in the translation. So I think you have to be quite open-minded about what content can be sacrificed for the sake of being easy to read, being enjoyable to read, being a consistent and comfortable text. Because after all, I think the judge, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, isn't it? The judge is the reader who isn't necessarily comparing the text to the original. The information is important, but so is being able to read it well and it being a good quality text.
And also it depends on the language. I mean, French, in France, if you want to explain anything to anyone, you first have to start with God created the world and it was good, and then eventually you'll get to how the washing machine works. And that's not how we do things in English generally. So there's that as well.
And then just from the point of view of an editor, this is not necessarily relevant in the case of the person who asked the question, but in general it strikes me that for translation, nonfiction, any translation, the role of the editor, I think perhaps is a little bit more important, especially if there is not an agent involved, and the need to communicate from the very beginning, at the contracting stages, to bring up that, and especially when it's nonfiction and you know that it may be something that is going to require a lot of extra research, to bring that up with your editor at the very beginning, and then to kind of consistently check in with each other. And I know from my point of view, I would never want to sacrifice quality for time. That would be very painful for, I think, everybody involved. So within reason, of course. But no, I think that's pretty safe to say that is not a fair exchange. So in all cases, but particularly when you're embarking on something new, and in nonfiction, heavy research-based nonfiction, please do understand that you need to be in contact with your editor throughout.
I think one thing is, always worth saying on every single discussion about translation, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, is that in a lot of language combinations, it's worth the translator educating the editor slightly about the different editorial standards between one country and another. And to be honest, I was actually quite surprised. Like I've sort of expected that from Arabic, because I think that editorial standards are relatively lax. And a lot of books actually haven't been copy edited at all before. Some texts are even literally not been edited by anybody other than the author before I translate them. So that's challenging. I actually didn't ever expect to find that as such a difficulty with German, but I think even with German, to be honest, editors are quite standoffish. We'll edit the text, but not necessarily copy edit for length or verbosity. And so it's an important part of the process is actually helping the copy editor to identify perhaps where something does need to be trimmed, because I think English books, especially trade non-fiction, is more to the point. You haven't necessarily got a captive audience who's going to have the patience to read a text as long as maybe a German reader would. And actually, with the Farewell to the Horse, I almost expected us to edit it more. I was surprised actually that it came out pretty much the same length.
Another question?
Thank you. Roland, at the beginning you spoke particularly about fact-checking, and that's been mentioned by others as well. To what extent do you personally feel it is your responsibility to check the height of that mountain and so on, or do you feel the fact-checking would tend to get spread across the team, so you and the editor maybe going back to the writer?
I didn't hear that entirely.
Oh, from the beginning, shall I start again? Fact-checking, I'll make it very short. To what extent do you feel it is your responsibility as translator?
Well, I mean, contractually, it's generally not yours at all. But, I mean, I sort of can't help doing it. It's a great way to waste time. I mean, I think it's certainly the more I care about a book and the text, the more I want it to be as great as possible in English. So, you know, if I have to do that remedial work, then fine. I don't know, it's just something that happens as I go along. You know, if there are references to places in the world I don't know, or people, or anything that I don't know and I'm not sure what it is, I kind of need to check. You know, place names is an interesting one because often they're spelled differently in different languages. You know, in English we have conventions for how we write Russian words, or you know, words in any language that doesn't use the Roman alphabet. And those rules aren't quite the same in French, for example. So it just becomes a habit, really. And so quite often I'll send something back with little notes saying, error in the French, this is not right. The mountain is lower than you say it is.
At the TA Symposium on Monday this week, we had a session with a copy editor talking about what she does. And she said she regards fact-checking as her responsibility. So we have that from the horse's mouth. But she also said that every fresh pair of eyes on a text is a good thing. So, you know, it's a kind of belt and braces approach, I think, if the translator is fact-checking as well. And I would always do it.
It also depends how far you can go. I mean, is it as simple as checking something on the internet, or do you have to travel somewhere to check the facts? And that kind of limits how much we can do as well, and what we have access to, whether we have to join a subscription system on a database to access old newspapers or not. So, I mean, I limit to things I can do at my desk for free.
Totally. I had that quandary working on the Farewell to the Horse book. There were so many quotes that I felt like I ought to check, or wanted to check, but I couldn't. It was more expensive to go to London to go to the British Library for the day than it was to get a monthly subscription to Scribd, the online sort of resource. And then also even to buy some books secondhand, it was easier to get something cheap from World of Books than it was to actually go and find them in a library. I think I am very pedantic about fact-checking, partly because it helps reassure me that I have understood the text fully, or understood the point, the rhetorical point that the author is making. But actually, when I'm doing my first draft of a translation, I actually have to sort of lock myself away from the internet, to actually go and work in a shed with no Wi-Fi whatsoever, and just do the first draft without getting distracted, because it's so tempting to look everything up. Especially when I was working on the first Peter Wohlleben book about nature. It's about all of the nature and science you can learn by going out in your garden, and it's just literally so wide-ranging. From one page it's about magpies, next page it's about plant galls, the next thing it's about weather systems. Even a nature expert couldn't possibly be an expert in all of those things. And literally on like every half page there was something so fascinating I wanted to look up, but I had to restrain myself. But even then, I think being that kind of pedantic sort of taking on a copy editor role, I think it probably did help flag up some queries with the translator, or potentially possible mistakes in the original. I hate saying that, but there were some things that we thought, I don't know, we have to maybe change that. And they might not have been noticed by a copy editor. I think as a translator, you are the most detailed, most pedantic reader the book will ever have. You potentially read the book 5-6 times by the time you've got through it. So you're going to have noticed things that a copy editor might not. And also, sorry, one more thing. Sometimes we found difficulties just in changing measurements and things like that. So changing from imperial to metric, that has made me, or the other way around, metric to imperial, made me look up things and really check. And I've got myself all tangled up trying to work out the distance of the Earth from the Sun and the speed that the Earth was going around the universe, and that sort of thing. I felt like I had to do a lot of checking, but then I really relied on the copy editor to do a double check. Thanks.
But it can be. I mean, I very recently made a rod for my own back. I was doing a coffee table book about top cycling spots all over the world, and it's done by a French packager, as in they produce a book for an American imprint. And I thought I was an idiot. I said, do you think would the American publisher like the kilometers converted to miles? Oh yes, please, with the kilometers in brackets. And so, there was 100 of these cycling spots, and every single one had at least 3 or 4 measurements in and gradients in meters.
Yeah, that should be copy editor's job.
But let me just say, from the perspective of editor, publisher, the translator is absolutely not responsible for fact-checking. Most publishers, and certainly Amazon, has a very extensive copy editing, and on top of that, fact-checking, and on top of that, proof of the copy editing process. Amazon in particular has a very intense one, and it strikes me that this should all be part of that conversation with the editor, and maybe there are even ways to change the order of the fact checking. So, but outside of your own process, and whatever is required to fully understand the text in order to be able to translate it, it is absolutely not, and everyone should know that very clearly, the responsibility of the translator to fact check or to convert miles into kilometers. That's the copy editor's job.
I could probably earn twice as much next year if I just laid off a bit.
But we always welcome your insight. I think we have time for one more question in the purple.
Thanks. I just wondered if you could say the people on the panel could say something about the role of pitching, if there is a role, because with fiction, obviously, translators pitching books plays quite a big role, but it sounded almost as if all of your books were commissioned. So could you say something about whether there is a role for translators pitching non-fiction books?
I don't see why there shouldn't be. If publishers are going to publish non-fiction in translation, which maybe they do tend to do a little less because they have their own experts in whatever field it is. But there's no reason a translator shouldn't approach them with projects. The thing about non-fiction is it's a little bit easier to pitch. If someone's interested in a subject matter they'll know they're interested in it. It's the same as selling non-fiction books. It's a little easier to find the market, I think, because it's you know what it is, you know what it's about. So someone interested in horses or guns or whatever else, they'll find the books. Whereas novels have I think a more trickier route to those readers. So perhaps it's the same with pitching, just at the first stage to the editors.
I think it's basically the same. I mean, you know, you have to see, are there similar books that are being published already? Is the target market interested in that particular thing? I think it's not necessarily different, although it's true, as you say, that probably fiction is harder for the publishers to find anyway. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, I would second that. I haven't actually successfully, well, I haven't pitched for a non-fiction book yet, but I'm just sort of working up to doing. But I do think that there is a greater chance of a non-fiction book being taken up because you can sort of more clearly make the point that this is providing new information or a new perspective. Whereas for fiction, publishers are so swamped by new titles. I just yesterday had my first ever meeting with a literary agent for a German publisher, and I realised just in that really brief conversation that we as translators really do have a role in being another sort of layer of being an agent. So we double up in lots of different ways. We're translators also a little bit copy editors, and we are translators also a little bit literary agents. And I think I knew that already, but I was surprised by that conversation yesterday that the German publisher, that's C.H. Beck, really deals directly with academic presses and actually don't have very good links with trade non-fiction. And I was like, oh, right, that's an opportunity to sort of, not necessarily represent them officially, but to make conversations about those books that they're not necessarily having themselves. And this is the book that I'm trying to pitch, which is A History of the World. And I'm carrying it around in my book, very heavy, carrying it around with myself, just in case I bump into somebody. But yeah, I don't know how successful that will be.
And I think we'll close on that note before we get kicked out. Most of us will be milling around here afterwards, and so feel free to come up and have a conversation with us. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. And thank you to our panelists.